That night, after Lyudmila and Nadia had gone to bed, Victor began filling in the questionnaire. Nearly all the questions were the same as before the war. Their very familiarity, however, somehow renewed Victor's anxiety. The state was not concerned about the adequacy of Victor's mathematical equipment, or the appropriateness of the laboratory apparatus or the complex experiments he was conducting. The state didn't want to know whether the staff were properly protected from neutron radiation, whether Sokolov and Strum had a good working relationship, whether the junior researchers had received adequate training for their exhausting calculations, whether they realized how much depended on their constant patience, alertness, and concentration. This was the questionnaire royal, the questionnaire of questionnaires. It wanted to know everything about Lyudmila's father and mother, and about Victor's grandfather and grandmother, where they had been born, where they had died, where they had been buried. In what connection had Viktor Pavlovich's father, Pavel Iosifovich, travelled to Berlin in 1910? There was something sinister about the state's anxious concern. Reading the questionnaire, Victor began to doubt himself. Was he really someone reliable? 1. Surname, name, and patronymic. Who was he? Who was this man filling in a questionnaire at the dead of night? Strum? Viktor Pavlovich? His mother and father had never been properly married. They had separated when Victor was only 2, and on his father's papers he had seen the name Pinkus, not Pavel. So why was he Viktor Pavlovich? Did he know himself? Perhaps he was someone quite different, Goldman, or Sagaidatchny. Or was he the Frenchman Desforges, alias Dubrovsky? Filled with doubt, he turned to the second question. 2. Date of birth. Year, month, day, to be given according to both old and new styles. What did he know about the dark December day? Could he really claim with any confidence to have been born at that precise moment? To disclaim such responsibility, should he not add the words, according to? 3. Sex. Victor boldly wrote, male. Then he thought, but what kind of a man am I? A real man would never have kept silent after the dismissal of Chepitsin. 4. Place of birth. According to both old and new systems of administration, province, county, district, village, and oblast, region, rural or urban district. Victor wrote Kharkov. His mother had told him he had been born in Bakhmut, but she had filled in his birth certificate 2 months later after moving to Kharkov. Should he be more precise? 5. Nationality. Point 5. This had been so simple and insignificant before the war. Now, however, it was acquiring a particular resonance. Pressing heavily on his pen, Victor wrote boldly and distinctly, Jew. He wasn't to know what price hundreds of thousands of people would soon have to pay for answering Kalmyk, Balkar, Chechen, Crimean Tatar, or Jew. He wasn't to know what dark passions would gather year by year around this point. He couldn't foresee what fear, anger, despair, and blood would spill over from the neighbouring 6th point, social origin. He couldn't foresee how, in a few years' time, many people would answer this 5th point with a sense of fatedness, the same sense of fatedness with which the children of Cossack officers, priests, landlords, and industrial magnates had once answered the 6th point. Nevertheless, Victor could already sense how the lines of force were shifting, how they were now gathering around this point. The previous evening, Landsman had phoned. Victor had told him of his failure to secure his nomination. Just as I'd expected, Landsman had said angrily and reproachfully. Is there something awkward in your background? Victor had asked. Landsman had snorted and said, There's something awkward in my surname. And while they were drinking tea that evening, Nadia had said, Do you know, Papa, Micah's father said that next year they're not going to accept a single Jew in the Institute of International Relations. Well, thought Victor, If one's a Jew, then one's a Jew, and one must say so. 6. Social origin. This was the trunk of a mighty tree. Its roots went deep into the earth, while its branches spread freely over the spacious pages of the questionnaire. Social origin of mother and father, of mother's and father's parents, social origin of wife and wife's parents. If divorced, social origin of former wife together with her parents' occupation before the revolution. The Great Revolution had been a social revolution, a revolution of the poor. Victor had always felt that this 6th point was a legitimate expression of the mistrust of the poor for the rich, a mistrust that had arisen over thousands of years of oppression. Victor wrote, Petit bourgeois. Petit bourgeois? What kind of petit bourgeois was he? Suddenly, probably because of the war, he began to doubt whether there really was such a gulf between the legitimate Soviet question about social origin and the bloody, fateful question of nationality, as posed by the Germans. He remembered their evening discussions in Kazan and Madyarov's speech about Chekhov's attitude towards humanity. He thought to himself, to me, a distinction based on social origin seems legitimate and moral, but the Germans obviously consider a distinction based on nationality to be equally moral. One thing I'm certain of, it's terrible to kill someone simply because he's a Jew. They're people, like any others, good, bad, gifted, stupid, stolid, cheerful, kind, sensitive, greedy. Hitler says none of that matters. All that matters is that they're Jewish. And I protest with my whole being. But then we have the same principle. What matters is whether or not you're the son of an aristocrat, the son of a merchant, the son of a kulak. Or whether you're good-natured, wicked, gifted, kind, stupid, happy, is neither here nor there, and we're not talking about the merchants, priests and aristocrats themselves, but about their children and grandchildren. Does noble blood run in one's veins like Jewishness? Is one a priest or a merchant by heredity? Nonsense. Sofia Petrovskaya was the daughter of a general, the daughter of a provincial governor. Have her banished. And Komissarov, the Tsarist police stooge who grabbed Karakozov, would have answered the 6th point, petit bourgeois. He would have been accepted by the university. Stalin said, the son isn't responsible for the father, but he also said, an apple never falls far from the tree. Well, petit bourgeois it is. 7. Social position. White-collar worker? But clerks and civil servants are white-collar workers. A white-collar worker called Strum had elaborated the mathematics of the disintegration of atomic nuclei. Another white-collar worker called Markov hoped, with the aid of his new apparatus, to confirm the theories of the white-collar worker called Strum. That's it, though, he thought. White-collar worker. Victor shrugged his shoulders and got up. Making a gesture as if to brush someone off, he paced round the room. Then he sat down and went on with the questionnaire. 29. Have you or your closest relative ever been the subject of a judicial inquiry or trial? Have you been arrested? Have you been given a judicial or administrative sentence? When? Where? Precisely what for? If you were reprieved, when? Then the same question regarding Victor's wife. Victor felt his heart miss a beat. They showed no mercy. Different names flashed through his mind. I'm certain he's innocent. He's simply not of this world. She was arrested for not denouncing her husband. I think she got 8 years. I'm not sure. I don't write to her. I think she was sent to Temniki. I found out by chance. I met her daughter on the street. I don't remember exactly. I think he was arrested in early 1938. Yes, 10 years without right of correspondence. My wife's brother was a party member. I met him only occasionally. My wife and I don't write to him. I think my wife's mother visited him, yes, long before the war. His second wife was exiled for failing to denounce her husband. She died during the war. Her son volunteered for the front and for the defence of Stalingrad. My wife separated from her first husband. Her son, by that marriage, my own stepson, died during the defence of Stalingrad. Her first husband was arrested. My wife has heard nothing of him from the moment of his arrest. I don't know the reason for his arrest. I've heard vague talk of his belonging to the Trotskyist opposition, but I'm not sure. I wasn't in the least interested. He was seized by a feeling of irreparable guilt and impurity. He remembered a meeting at which a party member, confessing his faults, had said, "Comrades, I'm not one of us." Suddenly Victor rebelled. "No, I'm not one of the obedient and submissive. I'm all on my own. My wife is no longer interested in me, but so what? I won't renounce those unfortunates who died for no reason." "You should be ashamed of yourselves, comrades. How can you bring up such things? These people are innocent. What can their wives and children be guilty of? It's you who should repent, you who should be begging forgiveness, and you want to prove my inferiority, to destroy my good name, simply because I'm related to these innocent victims? All I'm guilty of is failing to help them." At the same time, another quite opposite train of thought was running through Victor's mind. I didn't keep in touch with them. I never corresponded with enemies of the party. I never received letters from camps. I never gave them material help. I met them only infrequently and by chance. 30. Do any of your relatives live abroad? Where? Since when? Their reasons for emigrating? Do you remain in touch with them? This question increased Victor's depression. Comrades, surely you understand that emigration was the only possible choice under the Tsarist regime. It was the poor, the lovers of freedom, who emigrated. Lenin himself lived in London, Zurich and Paris. Why are you exchanging winks as you read the list of my uncles and aunts, living, together with their sons and daughters, in New York, Paris and Buenos Aires? A friend of mine once joked, "I've got an aunt in New York. I always knew that hunger's no friendly aunt. Now I know that aunts mean hunger." The list of his relatives abroad turned out to be almost as long as the list of his scientific works. And if one added the list of those who had been arrested, this was how to flatten a man. "He's an alien. Throw him out." But it was all a lie. Science needed him, not Gavronov or Dubyonkov. And he was ready to give his life for his country. And were people with spotless questionnaires incapable of deception or betrayal? And were there no people who had written "Father Swindler" or "Father Landowner," and then given their own lives in battle, joined the partisans, been executed? What was all this? He knew only too well the statistical method, probability theory. There was a greater probability of finding enemies among people of a non-proletarian background, and it was on these same grounds, probability theory, that the German fascists had destroyed whole peoples and nations. The principle was inhuman, blind and inhuman. There was only one acceptable way of relating to people, a human way. If he were choosing staff for his laboratory, he'd draw up a very different questionnaire, a human questionnaire. It was all the same to him whether his future colleague was a Russian, a Jew, a Ukrainian, or an Armenian, whether his grandfather had been a worker, a factory owner, or a kulak. His relationship with him would not depend on whether or not his brother had been arrested by the organs of the NKVD. It didn't matter to him whether his future colleague's sister lived in Geneva or Kostroma. He would ask at what age someone had first become interested in theoretical physics, what he thought of the criticisms Einstein had made of Planck when the latter was an old man, whether he was interested only in mathematical theory, or whether he also enjoyed experimental work, what he thought of Heisenberg. Did he believe in the possibility of a unified field theory? What mattered was talent, fire, the divine spark. He would like to know, but only if his future colleague was happy to say, whether he enjoyed long walks, whether he drank wine, whether he went to orchestral concerts, whether he liked Seton Thompson's children's books, whether he felt more drawn to Tolstoy or to Dostoevsky, whether he enjoyed gardening, whether he went fishing, what he thought of Picasso, which was his favourite story of Chekhov's. He'd also like to know whether this future colleague was taciturn or talkative, whether he was good-natured, witty, resentful, irritable, ambitious, whether he was likely to start an affair with the pretty young Vorochka Ponomariova. Madyarov had spoken extraordinarily well about all this. Perhaps he really was a provocateur. Oh my God. Victor took his pen and wrote, Esther Semyonovna Dashevskaya, my aunt on my mother's side, has lived since 1909 in Buenos Aires, working as a teacher of music. Victor entered Chichakov's office determined to remain calm and composed, not to utter a single aggressive word. He knew very well how stupid it was to take offence simply because he and his work were held in such low esteem by a mere bureaucrat. As soon as he saw Chichakov's face, however, he felt a sense of uncontrollable irritation. Alexey Alexeyevich, he began, one can't, of course, go against one's own nature, but you haven't once shown the least interest in the assembly of our new apparatus. In a conciliatory tone, Chichakov answered, I shall certainly visit you in the immediate future. The gracious boss had promised to honour Victor with a visit. I think that in general the administration has been sufficiently attentive to your needs, Chichakov added, especially the personnel department. What difficulty has been occasioned you by the personnel department? Asked Chichakov, in the same conciliatory tone. You're the first head of a laboratory to make any complaint. Alexey Alexeyevich, I've been trying in vain to have Vice Papier recalled from Kazan. In the field of nuclear photography, she's quite irreplaceable. I protest categorically against the dismissal of Loshakova. She's an exceptional worker and an exceptional human being. I can't imagine how you can dismiss Loshakova. It's inhuman. And finally, I wish to have my nomination of Landsman confirmed. He's a very talented young man. You underestimate the importance of our laboratory. Otherwise, I wouldn't be wasting my time on conversations of this nature. I'm wasting my own time too, said Chichakov. Victor felt glad that Chichakov had abandoned his conciliatory tone. Now he could give free rein to his anger. What strikes me as particularly unpleasant is that these conflicts have arisen principally around people with Jewish surnames. Very well, Victor Pavlovich, said Chichakov, taking the offensive. The Institute is faced with a number of very important tasks. As you know, we have been entrusted with these tasks at a very difficult time. I consider your laboratory unable at present to assist us with these tasks, and your own work, as disputable as it is interesting, has received far too much attention. This is not merely a personal point of view, he went on, a note of authority appearing in his voice. There are comrades who consider that the excessive attention paid to your work has disrupted scientific research. All this was discussed in considerable detail only yesterday. The view was put forward that your theories contradict the materialist view of the nature of matter and need to be reconsidered. You are to be asked to give a speech to that effect yourself. Certain people, for reasons that are obscure to me, would like to establish various doubtful theories as central tenets of our science, and at a time when we need to focus all our energies on the tasks imposed on us by the war. All this is extremely serious, and now here you are making terrible insinuations concerning a certain Loshakova. Excuse me, but I was unaware that Loshakova was a Jewish name. At this, Victor lost his head. No one had ever spoken to him about his work with such undisguised hostility, least of all an academician who was the director of his own institute. No longer afraid of the consequences, Victor blurted out everything that was on his mind. He said that it was of no concern to physics whether or not it confirmed philosophy. that the logic of mathematical proof was more powerful than that of Engels and Lenin, that it was for Badin of the scientific section of the Central Committee to accommodate Lenin's views to mathematics and physics, not for mathematicians and physicists to accommodate their views to Lenin's. He said that an excessive pragmatism would always be the death of science, though it were commanded by the Lord himself. Only a great theory could give birth to great practical achievements. He was confident that the principal technical problems, not only technical problems, of the 20th century would be resolved through the theory of nuclear reactions. He was only too willing to give a speech to that effect if this should be considered necessary by the comrades whose names Shishakov preferred not to reveal. As for the matter of people with Jewish surnames, that's not something you can laugh off quite so easily, not if you consider yourself a member of the intelligentsia. If my requests are denied, I shall be compelled to resign from the Institute immediately. I am unable to work under these conditions. Victor took a breath, looked at Shishakov, thought for a moment and said, "It's very difficult for me to work under these conditions. I am a human being as well as a physicist. I feel ashamed before people who expect my help, who count on my protection against injustice." This time, Victor had only to say, "It's very difficult." He no longer had the nerve to repeat his threat of immediate resignation. Shishakov obviously noticed this. Perhaps for this very reason he insisted, "There's no point in continuing this conversation in the language of ultimata. It's my duty, of course, to take your requests into consideration." Throughout the rest of the day, Victor had a strange feeling of both joy and depression. The laboratory equipment, the new apparatus, already nearly assembled, seemed a part of his life, a part of his brain, a part of his body. How could he exist without them? It was terrifying even to think what heresies he had uttered to the director. At the same time, however, Victor felt strong. His very helplessness was a source of strength. How could he ever have guessed that on his return to Moscow, at the moment of his scientific triumph, he would be having a conversation like this? Although no one could have heard about his confrontation with Shishakov, his colleagues seemed to be treating him with a particular warmth. Anna Stepanovna took his hand, squeezed it, and said, "Victor Pavlovich, I don't want to appear to be thanking you, but I do know that you've been true to yourself." Victor stood beside her in silence. He felt very moved, almost joyful. "Mother, mother," he thought suddenly, "can you see?" On the way home, Victor decided not to say anything to Lyudmila. However, his habit of sharing everything with her proved too strong. As he came through the door and began taking off his coat, he said, "Well, Lyudmila, it's happened. I'm leaving the Institute." Lyudmila was very upset, but she still managed to say something wounding. "You're behaving as though you were Lomonosov or Mendeleev. If you leave, then Sokolov or Markov will just take your place." She looked up from her sewing. "Besides, why can't your landsman go to the front? Otherwise it really does look to a prejudiced observer as though one Jew is looking after another." All right," said Victor. "That's enough. Do you remember that line of Nekrasov's? He hoped to be admitted to the Temple of Fame, and then was glad to be admitted to hospital. I thought I'd earned my daily bread, and now they're asking me to repent my sins and heresies. More than that, they want me to make a public confession. It's madness, and at a time when I've been nominated for a Stalin Prize, when students are seeking me out. It's all Badin's doing. Oh, no, it's nothing to do with Badin. Sadko doesn't love me." Lyudmila came up to him, straightened his tie, and turned down the collar of his jacket. "You look pale. Did you have any lunch?" "I don't feel like eating." "Have some bread and butter while I warm you up your supper." She poured out a few drops of his heart medicine and said, "I don't like the look of you. Drink this. Let me check your pulse." They went through to the kitchen. As he chewed his bread, Victor kept glancing at the mirror Nadia had hung by the gas meter. "How strange it all is," he said. How could I ever have guessed that I'd have to answer drawerfuls of questionnaires and hear what I've heard today? What power! The state and the individual. The state raises a man up, then throws him effortlessly into the abyss. Vitya, said Lyudmila, I want to talk to you about Nadia. Almost every night she comes home after curfew. Oh, you told me about that the other day. I know I did. Well, yesterday evening I happened to go up to the window and lift up the blackout curtain, and what do you think I saw? Nadia and some soldier. They walked down the street, stopped outside the dairy, and began kissing. Well, I never! Victor was so astonished as he stopped chewing, and the food is still in his mouth. Nadia kissing a soldier? After a few minutes' silence, Victor began to laugh. He was quite stunned. Probably nothing else could have distracted him from his own sombre preoccupations. For a moment their eyes met, and to her surprise, Lyudmila burst out laughing as well. Their empathy was complete, that rare understanding that needs neither thoughts nor words. It was no surprise to Lyudmila when Victor, apparently apropos of nothing at all, said, Mila, I was right to have it out with Shishakov, wasn't I? His train of thought was quite simple, though not so easy for an outsider to follow. Several things had come together. Memories of his past, the fate of Tolya and Anna Semyonovna, the war, the fact that, however rich and famous a man may be, he will still grow old, die, and yield his place to the young, that perhaps nothing matters except to live one's life honestly. And so he asked, I was right, wasn't I? Lyudmila shook her head. Decades of intimacy can also divide people. Lyuda, said Victor humbly, people who are in the right often don't know how to behave. They lose their tempers and swear. They act tactlessly and intolerantly. Usually they get blamed for everything that goes wrong at home and at work. While those who are in the wrong, those who hurt others, always know how to behave. They act calmly, logically and tactfully, and appear to be in the right. Nadia came in after 10 o'clock. As she heard the key in the lock, Lyudmila said, Go on, have a word with her. It's easier for you, said Victor. But as Nadia came into the room with dishevelled hair and a red nose, it was Victor who said, Who are you kissing opposite the front door? Nadia looked round as though about to run away, and for a moment she just gaped at Victor. And then she shrugged her shoulders and said calmly, Andrusha Lomov. He's at military school. He's a lieutenant. Are you going to marry him, then? Asked Victor, astonished at Nadia's self-possession. He looked round to see Lyudmila's reaction. Marry him? Nadia sounded very grown-up, irritated but basically unconcerned. Maybe. I'm thinking of it. And then maybe not. I haven't made up my mind yet. At last Lyudmila said something. Nadia, why did you tell all those lies about Micah's father and his lessons? I never told lies to my mother. Victor remembered how, when he was courting Lyudmila, she had come to meet him and say, I've left Tolya with mother. I told her I was going to the library. All of a sudden, Nadia was a child again. In an angry, whining voice she shouted, And do you think it's right to spy on me? Did your mother spy on you? Don't you dare be so insolent to your mother, you little fool, roared Victor. Nadia gave him a look of patient boredom. So, Nadezhda Viktorovna, it seems you haven't yet decided whether to marry the young colonel or to become his concubine. No, I haven't, and he's not a colonel. Could some young lad in a military gaitcoat really be kissing his daughter? Could he be falling in love with this brat of a girl, this ridiculous, sharp-witted little idiot? Could he be kissing her puppy-like eyes? But then this was an old story. Lyudmila said nothing more. She knew that Nadia would only get angry and clam up. She also knew that when they were alone, she'd run her fingers through her daughter's hair, and Nadia would sob, without knowing why. She herself would feel a sharp pang of pity for Nadia, also without knowing why. After all, there were worse things for a young girl than to be kissing a young man. And then Nadia would tell her all about this Lomov. She'd continue to run her fingers through Nadia's hair, all the time remembering her own first kisses and thinking of Tolia. Yes, now she linked everything to Tolia. There was something terribly sad about this girlish love, this love poised over the abyss of war. Tolia! Tolia! Victor was still ranting away, consumed by fatherly anxiety. Where's this man serving? I'm going to have a word with his commanding officer, chasing after babes in arms. He'll teach him a lesson. Nadia didn't say anything. As though bewitched by her haughtiness, Victor fell silent too, and then he asked, Why are you staring at me like that? You look like some member of a higher race studying an amoeba. Somehow the way Nadia was looking at him reminded him of Shishakov. He had watched Victor with the same calm self-confidence, looking down from his position of academic and political grandeur. His clear gaze had at once brought home to Victor the futility of his indignation, the futility of his protests and ultimatums. The power of the state reared up like a cliff of basalt. Yes, Shishakov could well afford to watch Victor's struggles with such indifference. In some strange way, this girl in front of him seemed also to understand the senselessness of his anger and indignation. She too seemed to understand that he was trying to achieve the impossible, to halt the flow of life itself. That night Victor felt as though he had ruined his whole life. His resignation from the Institute would be seen as a political gesture. He'd be considered a source of dangerous oppositional tendencies, at a time when Russia was at war, when the Institute had been granted Stalin's special favour. And then that terrible questionnaire, and that senseless conversation with Shishakov, and those discussions in Kazan and Madyarov. And suddenly he felt so terrified that he wanted to write to Shishakov and beg for forgiveness. He wanted the events of the day to be forgotten, blotted out. Returning from the store in the afternoon, Lyudmila saw a white envelope in the letterbox. Her heart, already fluttering after climbing the stairs, began to beat still faster. Holding the letter in her hand, she went down the corridor, opened Tolia's door, and looked in. The room was still empty. He hadn't returned. Lyudmila glanced through pages covered in a handwriting she had known since childhood, her own mother's. She saw the names Zhenya, Vera, and Stepan Fyodorovitch, but the name of her son was not there. Once again hope ebbed away, for the time being. Alexandra Vladimirovna said almost nothing about her own life, only a few words about her difficulties with the landlady. Apparently Nina Matveevna had behaved very unpleasantly since Lyudmila's departure. She wrote that she had heard nothing from Seryodcha, Stepan Fyodorovitch or Vera. She was worried about Zhenya. Something quite serious seemed to have happened to her, and she had written a letter hinting at various problems and saying she might have to go to Moscow. Lyudmila didn't know how to feel sad. She only knew how to grieve. Tolia. Tolia. Stepan Fyodorovitch was now a widower. Vera was a homeless orphan. Seryodcha might or might not be alive. Perhaps he was crippled. Perhaps he was lying in some military hospital. His father had either died in a camp or been shot. His mother had died in exile. Alexandra Vladimirovna's house had burnt down. She was alone, with no news of either her son or her grandson. Alexandra Vladimirovna didn't say a word about her own health. She didn't say whether her room was heated. She didn't say whether her rations had increased. Lyudmila understood the reason for this all too well. Lyudmila's home was now cold and empty. The warmth had drained out of it. It was a ruin. It was as though it had been destroyed by terrible, invisible bombs. She thought a lot about Victor that day. Their relationship had gone sour. Victor was angry and treated her coldly. The saddest thing of all was that she didn't mind. She knew him too well. From the outside, everything about him seemed exalted and poetic, but she didn't see people that way. Masha saw Victor as a noble sage, a martyr. Masha loved music and would go pale when she listened to the piano. Sometimes Victor played for her. She obviously needed someone to adore. She had created for herself an exalted image, a Victor who had never existed. But if she were to watch Victor day in and day out, she'd be disenchanted soon enough. Lyudmila knew that Victor was moved only by egotism, that he cared for no one. Even now, though his confrontation with Shishakov filled her with fear and anxiety on his behalf, she felt the usual irritation. He was ready to sacrifice both his work and the peace of his family for the selfish pleasure of strutting about and posing as a defender of the weak. Yesterday, in his anxiety about Nadia, he had forgotten his egotism, but was he capable of forgetting his troubles and showing the same anxiety on Tolya's behalf? She herself had been mistaken yesterday. Nadia hadn't been fully open with her. Was it just a childish infatuation? Or was this her destiny? Nadia had spoken quite freely about the circle of friends where she had first met Lomov. She had told Lyudmila how they read futurist and symbolist poetry, how they argued about art, even about their contemptuous mockery for things which, in Lyudmila's eyes, deserved neither contempt nor mockery. Nadia had answered Lyudmila's questions with good grace and seemed to be speaking the truth. No, we don't drink, apart from one evening when someone was leaving for the front. And we talk about politics now and then. No, not in the same language as Pravda, but only occasionally, just once or twice. But as soon as Lyudmila began asking about Lomov himself, Nadia became edgy. No, he doesn't write poetry. How do you expect me to know about his parents? I've never even met them. What's strange about that? Lomov doesn't know anything about father. He probably thinks he works in a food store. What was all this? Was it Nadia's destiny? Or would it be quite forgotten in a month's time? As she got the supper ready and did the washing, she thought in turn about her mother, Vera, Zenya, and Seryotcha. She rang Maria Ivanovna, but no one answered. She rang the Postoyevs. The domestic answered that her employer was out shopping. She rang the janitor about a broken tap, but apparently the plumber hadn't come into work. She sat down to write a long letter to her mother. She meant to say how sad she was that she had failed to make Alexandra Vladimirovna feel at home, how much she regretted her decision to stay on alone in Kazan. Lyudmila's relatives had given up coming to stay with her before the war. Now not even the very closest of them came to visit her in her large Moscow flat. Lyudmila didn't write the letter. All she did was spoil 4 sheets of paper. Towards the end of the afternoon, Victor phoned to say that he'd be staying late at the institute. The technicians he'd wanted from the military factory were coming that evening. Is there any news? Asked Lyudmila. You mean about all that? No, nothing. In the evening, Lyudmila read through her mother's letter again, and then got up and went over to the window. The moon was shining, and the street was quite empty. And once again she saw Nadia, arm in arm with her lieutenant. They were walking down the road towards the flat. Suddenly, Nadia started to run, and the young man in military greatcoat stood there, in the middle of the road, gazing after her. Everything most incompatible suddenly fused together in Lyudmila's heart. Her love for Victor, her resentment of Victor, her anxiety on Victor's behalf, Tolya, who had died without ever kissing a girl's lips, the lieutenant standing there in the road, Vera climbing happily up the staircase of her house in Stalingrad, poor homeless Alexandra Vladimirovna, her soul filled with the sense of life that is man's only joy and his most terrible pain.